Human family finds injured velociraptor. The result is truly heartwarming. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Deep in the heart of the Arizona desert, where the rugged terrain met the endless sky, the Johnson family was on an adventure unlike any other. They had set out on a paleontology expedition, an annual tradition that had become a bonding experience between father, mother, and daughter. Dr. James Johnson, a seasoned paleontologist, had spent his career uncovering the remains of long-extinct creatures, but never in his wildest dreams did he expect to find something still breathing. Alongside him was his wife, Claire, an avid wildlife photographer, and their 15-year-old daughter, Emily, who had inherited their mutual fascination for dinosaurs. It was a blisteringly hot afternoon when Emily, armed with a small brush and a keen eye, stumbled upon something that made her heart pound. Near a jagged rock formation, beneath the shade of an outstretched canyon wall, she saw movement, something that shouldn't be there. She gasped and took a cautious step forward, signaling her parents. "Mom, Dad, come quick," she called, her voice filled with excitement and fear. James and Claire hurried over, their boots crunching on the dry earth. What they saw left them speechless. Lying amidst scattered bones and desert shrubs was a living, breathing velociraptor. Its golden yellow eyes blinked up at them, filled with an emotion that Emily could only describe as pain. The creature's lean, muscular body bore a long stripe of black and green across its back, but it was injured. Its left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and its chest heaved erratically. Claire instinctively raised her camera, but James placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Wait, we need to help it," he said in a hushed voice, mesmerized by the living miracle in front of them. His mind raced with questions. How was this possible? Could it be some genetic experiment gone wrong? Had something survived where no one had looked? Emily knelt down cautiously, feeling the weight of the moment. "It's hurt," she whispered. Her heart pounded as the raptor made a weak attempt to move, its clawed foot barely twitching. It was small for a velociraptor, perhaps a juvenile, its scales dull with dust and exhaustion. The predator, which would have been a terror millions of years ago, was now defenseless. James swallowed his fear and took a step forward. "We can't just leave it here," he said, glancing at Claire. She nodded hesitantly, her hands tightening around her camera strap. The decision was made. Using their camping supplies, they carefully constructed a makeshift stretcher. James wrapped the raptor's injured leg with fabric torn from his own shirt, while Emily stroked its head softly, whispering reassurances. She had always loved animals, but never in her life had she imagined comforting a dinosaur. To her surprise, the raptor responded, its eyes half closing in what seemed to be trust. As they lifted the creature onto the stretcher, it let out a weak growl but did not resist. It was as if it understood that they were helping. James and Claire carried it back to their campsite, where they laid it beside the fire under the soft glow of twilight. For the next few hours, they worked tirelessly to stabilize the raptor's injuries. James set its broken leg using splints from spare tent poles, while Claire cleaned the gash along its ribs. Emily stayed by its side, whispering gentle words, and to everyone's amazement, the raptor let her. "What do we call it?" Emily asked as she stroked the scaly ridge above its eye. James hesitated. "We don't want to get too attached," he cautioned. "But for now, let's call it something simple." Claire smiled. "How about Echo?" The name felt right. The raptor blinked, as if acknowledging the choice, before closing its eyes completely. That night, as the desert air turned cool and the stars glittered above, Emily found herself unable to sleep. She sat beside Echo, watching its slow breathing, wondering about the mystery of its existence. Where had it come from? Were there more? The thought both terrified and thrilled her. Morning arrived with the chirping of birds and the warmth of the rising sun. James checked Echo's wounds and noted that, while weak, the raptor was stable. "We need to figure out what we do next," he said, rubbing his temples. "We can't exactly call the authorities and say we found a living dinosaur." Emily bit her lip, What if we try to track where it came from? Maybe it's not alone. Claire glanced at Echo, then at her husband. James, you know she's right. If there's one, there could be more. James exhaled. All right, he agreed. But we need to be careful. With Echo still too weak to move on its own, they secured it safely in the shade and set out with their gear. The desert stretched infinitely, the wind whispering through the rock formations. Every step forward felt like a step into the unknown. An hour into their trek, they found something shocking. Huge clawed footprints embedded in the sand, far fresher than any fossilized remains. James knelt, tracing the prints with his fingers. These are from a much bigger raptor, he murmured. Echo wasn't alone. Emily's stomach twisted. Do you think it's looking for Echo? Before James could answer, a distant, chilling sound echoed through the canyon. A deep, throaty call that sent shivers down their spines. Something was out there. They weren't alone. The eerie call echoed through the canyon, sending a wave of unease over the Johnson family. Emily's heart pounded as she exchanged nervous glances with her parents. James instinctively pulled her closer, his mind racing. If Echo had come from a group, they were now walking straight into their territory. We should go back, Claire whispered, gripping her camera tightly. If these raptors are anything like their fossil records suggest, they'll be highly intelligent. And territorial. James hesitated, torn between his instincts as a scientist and his responsibility as a father. Emily, however, was transfixed by the footprints. She crouched beside them, tracing the sharp edges with her fingers. These aren't just from one raptor, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. There are at least 3 different sets here. James inspected the prints again, nodding in agreement. She's right. Some are larger, but this smaller set, he trailed off, eyes widening. This one belongs to Echo. Claire's breath hitched. So, they left her behind. Emily swallowed hard. Or she got lost. A rustling in the brush behind them made them freeze. The sound was faint but deliberate. Something was moving, circling them. James raised a hand, signaling for them to stay silent. Claire gripped her camera strap like a lifeline, her pulse pounding in her ears. Another rustle, then a low guttural growl. James' body went rigid. He slowly turned his head, scanning the rocky outcrops above them. Shadows danced between the boulders, but one in particular caught his attention. A long, sinuous tail flicking between the rocks. We need to move, he murmured. Now? Emily's heart pounded as they carefully retraced their steps, moving as slowly and as non-threateningly as possible. But just as they reached the halfway point back to their campsite, the growl came again, closer this time. And then, from the shadows, it emerged. A full-grown Velociraptor. The creature was magnificent, larger than Echo. Its scales a deep emerald green with streaks of charcoal black running down its spine. Its golden eyes locked onto them with terrifying intelligence. It wasn't just watching them, it was assessing them. Emily couldn't breathe. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, but she knew better. Any sudden movement could provoke an attack. James carefully positioned himself between the raptor and his family. No one move, he whispered. No sudden movements. The raptor took a step forward, its claws clicking against the stone. It tilted its head, nostrils flaring, as if taking in their scent. And then, something unexpected happened. The raptor's eyes flicked past them, toward their campsite, toward Echo. Emily saw the moment the realization hit. The raptor's posture changed, shifting from predatory to something else entirely. Its growl softened into a deep, throaty rumble, almost questioning. James caught on quickly. It knows Echo, he whispered. Claire's fingers trembled around her camera. Could it be her mother? Emily's heart raced. We need to let her see Echo, she said urgently. Maybe if she sees we're helping, she won't attack. James hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. Slowly, let's go. Keeping their movements deliberate, they backed away toward the campsite. The raptor followed at a cautious distance, its sharp gaze never leaving them. When they finally reached the camp, Echo lay curled in the shade, her breathing steady but weak. She hadn't noticed them yet, until the larger raptor let out a low, warbling sound. Echo's head jerked up. The moment her golden eyes met the larger raptor's, everything changed. Echo let out a high-pitched chirp, her body twitching in excitement despite her injuries. The larger raptor responded with a series of deep, guttural sounds, communication. It stepped forward, hesitating only when it noticed the human presence. Emily slowly knelt beside Echo, keeping her voice soft. "It's okay," she whispered. "They're here for you." Echo made another small sound and tried to stand, but her injured leg gave out beneath her. The larger raptor's posture tensed, and for a terrifying moment, Emily thought it would lunge. But instead, it let out another call, this time higher in pitch. And then, more rustling. 2 more raptors emerged from the rocks. Emily gasped, her pulse hammering in her ears. One was slightly smaller than the first but equally fearsome, with dark brown scales and a jagged scar across its snout. The other was the smallest of the trio, its bright amber eyes darting from Echo to the humans. James tensed but didn't move. "This is a pack," he murmured. She wasn't alone after all. The first raptor, the leader, took another step forward, then another, closing the distance between itself and Echo. The injured raptor let out another chirp, stretching her neck toward the others. And then, something truly astonishing happened. The leader gently pressed its snout against Echo's, emitting a soft, almost affectionate rumble. The others followed, nuzzling their injured packmate with surprising tenderness. Emily's throat tightened. "They're comforting her," she whispered. Claire, still gripping her camera, had tears in her eyes. They came back for her. James, ever the scientist, was watching in awe. This level of social bonding. It's incredible. The leader suddenly turned its gaze back to them. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the raptor did something unexpected. It took a step back and let out a sharp, deliberate sound. Emily felt a chill go down her spine. That's a signal. The other 2 raptors moved in closer, positioning themselves around Echo. Carefully, as if guiding her, they helped lift her to her feet. Echo wobbled but leaned into their support. "They're taking her home," James realized. Emily's chest tightened. But she's still hurt. What if she can't make it? The leader let out another sound, short, firm. It was reassuring them, telling them this wasn't their fight anymore. Echo gave Emily one last look before nudging her snout against her arm. A soft farewell. And then, with slow but determined steps, the pack disappeared into the canyon. Emily watched them go, tears blurring her vision. She had saved Echo, but in the end, Echo had found her way back home. The eerie call reverberated through the canyon walls, sending an undeniable chill through the Johnsons. It was a sound both ancient and unfamiliar, something primal that tugged at their instincts, warning them that they were no longer at the top of the food chain. James exchanged a glance with Claire, his breath hitching. "We need to move," he whispered. Emily, however, stood frozen, her eyes darting between the massive footprints in the sand and the direction of the call. "What if it's looking for Echo?" she murmured. The thought made her chest tighten. Echo was still back at their camp, alone and vulnerable. James pulled her gently but firmly. "That's exactly why we need to go, before whatever made those tracks finds us first." With their hearts pounding, they carefully retraced their steps, moving swiftly but cautiously. Every shifting rock and rustling bush sent their nerves on edge, but they made it back to the campsite without incident. Echo was still lying under the shade, its golden eyes flickering open when it sensed them approaching. Emily knelt beside it, stroking its head reassuringly. "We found tracks," she whispered. "You weren't alone, were you?" The raptor made a weak but deliberate sound, something between a purr and a whimper. It turned its snout toward the open desert as if expecting something. That's when they heard it, the sound of shifting rocks, the distinct crunch of movement in the distance. James motioned for Claire and Emily to stay low. He reached for the rifle they always kept for emergencies while Claire grabbed a small knife from her backpack. It wasn't much against whatever was out there, but it was better than nothing. The tension in the air was suffocating. Then, From behind a cluster of jagged boulders, something moved. It wasn't another human. A much larger velociraptor stepped into view, its dark, glossy scales reflecting the golden sunlight. This one was at least twice the size of Echo, its sleek, muscular frame rippling with every step. Its long, sickle-shaped claws flexed as it sniffed the air, its piercing yellow eyes locking onto Echo. Emily gasped softly. "That's... It's mother," she whispered. The larger raptor let out a guttural clicking noise, a sound so purposeful it almost felt like language. Echo, still weak, managed to lift its head and respond with a softer, chirping sound. "They're communicating," Claire murmured, unable to take her eyes off the breathtaking scene before them. James, however, was still gripping the rifle tightly. "We don't know how this will play out," he warned. "We're standing between a mother and her young." Emily slowly stepped forward, against her father's protests. "She's looking for Echo," she insisted, "and we brought her back." The mother raptor took another slow step forward, its gaze flicking between Echo and the humans. It was assessing the situation. Emily held up her hands, keeping her movements calm and deliberate. "We helped her," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Echo let out another soft chirp, and for a moment, everything seemed frozen in time. Then, the mother raptor did something none of them expected. It lowered its head slightly, its massive tail twitching behind it. "It's a sign of trust," James whispered in disbelief. Claire reached for her camera but hesitated. Capturing this moment was tempting, but more than anything, she didn't want to risk startling the creature. Then, in an even more shocking turn, the mother raptor cautiously closed the distance between them. Emily instinctively stepped back, her heart racing, but the massive dinosaur wasn't interested in them. It was only focused on Echo. With the utmost gentleness, it leaned down and nudged the injured raptor with its snout. Echo let out a soft, relieved chirp. "She's checking on her," Emily breathed. The air felt electric, charged with the weight of something monumental. Here they were, standing in the presence of two living, breathing dinosaurs, witnessing an interaction that no human had ever seen before. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, the mother raptor looked up, locking eyes with James. For a brief moment, there was an understanding, a silent acknowledgement. Then, with great care, the mother raptor used her powerful jaws to lift Echo by the scruff, as gently as a lioness would carry her cub. Echo didn't resist. She trusted her mother. James slowly lowered his rifle. Claire let out a shaky breath. "I can't believe this is happening." Emily felt her throat tighten. "She's taking her home," she whispered. The mother raptor turned, Echo secured in her grasp, and without another glance, disappeared back into the wild. The Johnson family stood in silence, watching as the two figures melted into the vast, endless desert. James exhaled deeply. "We just witnessed history." Emily wiped a stray tear from her cheek. "We did the right thing." Claire finally raised her camera and snapped one last photo. Not of the raptors, but of her family. Because this moment wasn't just about dinosaurs. It was about trust, kindness, and the knowledge that some things were never meant to be caged. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the small velociraptor lay curled in a bed of makeshift blankets, its sides rising and falling with labored breaths. Emma sat beside it, carefully stroking its scaly head with a tenderness she usually reserved for their golden retriever back home. She could still hardly believe it. This wasn't just some lizard or a large bird. It was a creature straight out of history, an animal thought to have vanished from existence millions of years ago. And yet, here it was, struggling for life in their care. Her father, Mark, crouched nearby, examining a collection of herbs and antiseptics they had managed to salvage from their camping supplies. "We need to clean this wound properly before it gets infected," he said, his voice low but firm. "The cut on its leg is deep, but it's not beyond saving." Emma's mother, Julia, sat on a rock, watching the entire scene unfold with a mixture of worry and awe. "How do we even know what it eats?" she asked. "Or if it's safe to keep it here with us?" "It's just a baby," Emma countered. "Look at it. Scared." The little raptor blinked, its golden eyes darting between the humans, still unsure whether they were friends or foes. It let out a soft, almost purring sound as Emma stroked its neck. It was the first sign of trust. Mark sighed. "All right, first, let's clean the wound. Then we can figure out the rest." He took a clean cloth, soaked it in antiseptic, and reached for the Velociraptor's leg. The moment he pressed against the wound, the little creature let out a shrill cry, its head snapping toward him, teeth bared. Emma instinctively placed a gentle hand on its snout, whispering in soft tones, "Sure, it's okay. We're helping you. Just stay still." The Velociraptor hesitated but didn't pull away. Instead, it closed its eyes, its body tensing as Mark continued dressing the wound. Julia shook her head in disbelief. This shouldn't be possible. Neither should dinosaurs still existing, Mark muttered as he secured the bandage. Once the wound was wrapped, they faced another problem: food. There was no telling what the little creature ate, but given its sharp teeth and agile build, it was likely a carnivore. Mark had caught fish earlier in the day, and after some discussion, they decided to see if the raptor would eat it. Emma tore off a small piece of fish and held it near the raptor's snout. The creature sniffed at it before hesitantly flicking out its tongue. A second later, it snapped up the fish, swallowing it in one quick motion. "That answers that," Mark said with a chuckle. As the evening stretched into night, the family took turns keeping watch, not just to ensure their safety, but also to check on their new prehistoric guest. They named it Echo for the way it occasionally let out soft clicking sounds that seemed to reverberate into the distance. Days passed, and as Echo regained strength, it became evident that the little raptor had started to trust them. It would follow Emma around, nuzzling against her leg whenever she sat down. It even seemed to understand basic commands, responding when called. Julia remained skeptical, but even she couldn't deny that something extraordinary was happening. One afternoon, as they were preparing to move camp, Echo suddenly tensed, its nostrils flaring. A low growl rumbled from its throat, and it took a defensive stance. Emma followed its gaze toward the tree-line, where movement flickered in the shadows. "Dad," she whispered, "something's out there." Mark's hand went instinctively to the hunting knife on his belt. Julia grabbed Emma's wrist, pulling her closer. They all watched as the bushes rustled again, and then another raptor stepped out. This one was bigger, stronger. Its dark green scales blended seamlessly into the foliage, and its piercing eyes locked onto Echo. Echo let out a high-pitched call, taking a step forward. "Is that its mother?" Julia asked, barely breathing. The larger raptor took another step, its posture rigid but not immediately aggressive. It let out a series of clicking sounds, and Echo responded in kind. Emma's heart pounded. They're communicating. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then, Echo turned back to Emma, pressing its snout into her palm one last time before stepping toward the larger raptor. "It's saying goodbye," Mark said softly. Emma felt tears sting her eyes. "I don't want it to go." Julia wrapped an arm around her daughter. "It belongs with its own kind." Echo hesitated a moment longer before running off into the wild, disappearing into the dense jungle. The larger raptor followed, and just like that, they were gone. The family stood in silence, processing what had just happened. Then, Mark placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "You helped save a creature from another time," he said. "And it will never forget you." Emma wiped her eyes and smiled. "Neither will I." As they packed up their camp and began their journey home, Emma took one last look at the jungle, hoping that somewhere out there, Echo was safe. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the canyon, the injured Velociraptor finally stirred. The couple had been carefully monitoring its breathing, noting every twitch and subtle movement. It was a juvenile, no larger than a medium-sized dog, but its powerful legs and razor-sharp claws were a testament to the predator it would become. Emma leaned closer, whispering, "I think it's waking up." Jackson kept his distance, wary of startling the creature. "We need to be careful. It may still see us as a threat." The raptor blinked, its golden eyes open, disoriented and weak. A faint clicking sound escaped its throat, a mixture of confusion and fear. Emma extended her hand, her fingers steady despite her racing heartbeat. "Sure, it's okay," she soothed. "We're not here to hurt you." The raptor tensed, its muscles tightening as it tried to rise. Pain shot through its injured leg, and it let out a sharp cry before collapsing back onto the sand. Emma's heart ached for it. She knew they couldn't leave it here. Alone, wounded, and defenseless. Jackson exhaled sharply. "We can't keep it here, Emma. It needs real care. And it's not safe for us either." She knew he was right, but there was something in the raptor's eyes. A flicker of recognition, or perhaps gratitude. It wasn't attacking them. Instead, it seemed to accept their presence, as if understanding they were its only hope. "We'll take it back to camp," Emma decided. "Just for tonight. We'll reassess in the morning." Jackson sighed. "All right, but if this goes sideways, it's on you." Carefully, they fashioned a makeshift sling using a blanket from their supplies. The raptor didn't resist as Emma and Jackson gently lifted it, securing its injured leg to minimize movement. It was surprisingly light, though its body was taut with silent tension. They carried it back through the winding canyon, the eerie stillness of the night settling around them. Every so often, the raptor let out a soft chirp, as if trying to communicate. Emma responded in kind, whispering reassurances, promising that everything would be okay. When they reached their campsite, they laid the raptor down near the fire, wrapping it in another blanket for warmth. Jackson examined the wound again. It wasn't as bad as he'd initially feared, just a deep gash, likely from a fall or a scuffle with another animal. Emma prepared some food, setting aside a piece of cooked meat. She hesitated before offering it to the raptor. It eyed the food, then her, before cautiously sniffing the air. A moment later, it weakly extended its neck and snapped up the meat, chewing slowly. Jackson chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, I guess that means we're officially raptor caretakers." Emma grinned. For now, at least. As the fire crackled and the stars blanketed the night sky, the couple sat beside their unexpected guest, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The raptor, no longer trembling, nestled into its blanket, its breathing slow and steady. For the first time in hours, it finally looked at peace. As the morning light seeped through the canyon, Emma awoke to the soft rustling of fabric. Blinking sleep from her eyes, she turned toward the raptor, who had shifted slightly in its makeshift nest. Its golden eyes were open now, more alert than before, scanning its surroundings. Jackson was already up, crouching nearby with a cautious but fascinated expression. "It's watching us," he whispered. Emma sat up slowly, careful not to startle their unusual guest. The raptor's gaze flicked to her, its pupils narrowing slightly. It wasn't afraid, more curious. The previous night's exhaustion had subdued it, but now that the pain had lessened, its natural instincts were kicking in. Emma reached for another piece of meat and held it out. The raptor sniffed the air, then hesitated. Jackson frowned. "Maybe it doesn't trust us yet." Emma thought for a moment before carefully placing the meat on the ground between them. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to take it from my hand." The raptor's nostrils flared. It lowered its head cautiously, testing the air. After a moment, it leaned forward and snapped up the food, chewing slowly. Jackson exhaled. "That's a good sign. It knows we're not a threat." Emma smiled. "And that we have food. That might be enough for now." They spent the morning monitoring the raptor's behavior, noting its movements and reactions. It was still weak, its injured leg preventing it from standing for long. But despite its predicament, it didn't lash out at them. If anything, it seemed a cooperative. Jackson furrowed his brow. "Do you think it's alone?" Emma's smile faded. Velociraptors were pack hunters. If this one was with others, they might still be out there. That realization sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. "So what happens when they come looking?" Emma didn't answer right away. She was still trying to figure out what to do next. They had no experience with dinosaurs, let alone a living, breathing velociraptor depending on them. But one thing was certain. They couldn't keep it here forever. Just then, the raptor made a low clicking sound deep in its throat. It was almost a call. Emma and Jackson exchanged glances. Did it just? Jackson started. The raptor repeated the noise, a little louder this time. It was calling out. Emma's heartbeat quickened. I think it's trying to contact its pack. A tense silence settled between them. If there were other raptors nearby, they might come searching. Jackson stood up, scanning the horizon. If its pack is out there, we need to decide if we're staying or leaving. Emma swallowed hard. We need to help it heal, but we also need to be ready. If its family comes back, she trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. Would they be relieved to find their lost member? Or would they see Emma and Jackson as a threat? The raptor clicked again, its gaze flicking toward the distant ridges of the canyon. Whatever happened next, Emma knew one thing for certain. Their time alone with the raptor was running out. The night passed in a surreal quiet, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. Emma had stayed awake for most of it, keeping an eye on the injured velociraptor as it rested. Jackson had dozed off beside her, his arm draped protectively over their gear, just in case their guest decided to turn hostile. But it hadn't. Instead, the young raptor remained nestled in the blanket, stirring only when the fire crackled a little too loudly or when Emma adjusted its makeshift splint. There was something strangely domestic about the scene. Two humans tending to a prehistoric creature as if it were nothing more than a stray dog in need of rescue. As the first light of dawn peeked through the canyon walls, the raptor finally lifted its head, blinking slowly. It let out a soft clicking sound, more curious than afraid. Emma smiled. "Good morning," she whispered. Jackson groaned as he stretched. "You're talking to it now?" he muttered. Emma rolled her eyes. "It's called bonding." Jackson sat up and eyed the raptor. "Or imprinting. Either way, we need to figure out what happens next." Emma reached for a small piece of leftover meat from their rations and held it out again. The raptor hesitated for a moment before cautiously taking it from her hand. This time, it chewed faster, the movement of its jaw more confident than the night before. Jackson sighed. "Okay, so it trusts us. That's great. But what happens when it's strong enough to walk again? It's still a wild animal, Emma." Emma bit her lip. He was right. This wasn't sustainable. Eventually, the raptor would have to return to the wild, to whatever pack or solitude awaited it. She reached out, gently running her fingers over its scaly hide. "We'll help it heal first. Then we can figure out what comes next." The raptor let out a soft purring noise, pressing ever so slightly into her touch. Jackson shook his head in disbelief. "It likes you," Emma chuckled. "Maybe it knows I'm the only reason you haven't left it behind." Jackson scoffed but didn't argue. By midday, the raptor had managed to stand, though it still wobbled. It leaned heavily on its good leg, testing the weight of its injured limb. Emma and Jackson watched in fascination as it took a hesitant step, then another. "Progress," Emma said softly. Jackson observed the way the raptor moved, his analytical mind kicking in. "It's still weak. It won't get far on its own. We should give it another day." Emma didn't argue. Another day meant another chance to learn more about this incredible creature. As the sun climbed higher, the trio sat together, two humans and a dinosaur, bound by an unspoken understanding that, for now, they were in this together. As the days passed, the Velociraptor, whom the family had named Echo due to the strange chirping sounds it made, began to recover. Its wounds, once raw and deep, started to heal thanks to the constant care provided by the family. Emma, the teenage daughter, was particularly attached to Echo, spending hours beside its makeshift enclosure, speaking softly and feeding it small pieces of raw meat. At first, the raptor was hesitant, its golden eyes filled with mistrust. But as Emma continued her gentle approach, Echo slowly began to associate the humans with safety and food. One evening, as the sun cast a golden hue over the horizon, Emma noticed something astonishing. Echo, who had been limping for weeks, stood up on both legs for the first time and let out a soft, almost affectionate chittering sound. The family gasped in awe, realizing that the once terrified creature was beginning to trust them. The transformation was undeniable. This wild predator, feared by history and science alike, was now showing signs of companionship. As the family spent more time with Echo, they noticed just how intelligent the creature was. It began to mimic their gestures, tilting its head when they spoke and responding to simple hand signals. Noah, the father, was the first to test this theory. He extended his hand slowly, palm facing up, and after a moment of hesitation, Echo tapped his hand gently with its claw. It was a small but significant breakthrough. However, deep in Noah's mind, a pressing question remained unanswered. What would happen next? Echo was a dinosaur, a creature that belonged to an era long gone. Keeping it hidden was becoming more difficult by the day. As its strength returned and its curiosity grew, it would often venture beyond the enclosed space, sniffing the perimeter of the yard and staring into the dark woods beyond. One night, the answer came in the most unexpected way. A loud, haunting screech echoed through the trees, followed by the rustling of underbrush. Echo's head shot up, its pupils dilating with an alertness the family had never seen before. It let out a response, a series of rapid clicks and calls, before sprinting toward the forest. Emma ran after it, fear gripping her heart. "Echo, wait!" she called out, but the raptor was already moving with a speed she couldn't match. Noah and his wife, Clara, rushed out with flashlights, their beams sweeping the dense foliage. The noise grew closer. Something was out there, something large. Noah's gut twisted as he considered the possibility. Was it another velociraptor? Was Echo calling out to its own kind? Then, out of the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes emerged. As the days passed, the injured velociraptor, whom the family had named Rexy, began to grow stronger. The bond between the dinosaur and its human caretakers deepened. Every morning, Rachel would sit by Rexy's side, speaking to him in a soothing voice, while Jason made sure his wounds were cleaned and properly tended to. The once fierce and wary creature now seemed to understand that the humans meant him no harm. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the red cliffs, Rexy did something that left the family speechless. As Jason walked over to check on him, the velociraptor nudged a small pile of sticks toward him. Confused at first, Jason took a closer look and realized that Rexy was trying to mimic the way humans built campfires. Rachel gasped in amazement. "He's learning from us," she whispered. It was clear now that Rexy was far more intelligent than they had initially thought. But their time together was running out. Rexy had healed considerably, and as much as the family had grown attached to him, they knew he couldn't stay with them forever. He belonged in the wild with his own kind, if any still existed. The thought of letting him go was heartbreaking, but they knew it was the right thing to do. On the day of his release, the family led Rexy to a clearing on the edge of the valley. He hesitated for a moment, his yellow eyes scanning their faces as if he understood what was happening. Rachel knelt beside him, stroking his scaly snout. "You're going to be okay out there," she whispered, her voice breaking. Then, without warning, a distant roar echoed through the valley. The family stiffened, turning their heads toward the source of the sound. It was another velociraptor. Their hearts pounded as Rexy's head snapped up, his eyes wide with recognition. He let out a chirping call, and moments later, two figures emerged from the shadows of the canyon. Two other raptors, their forms sleek and powerful against the setting sun. Tears welled up in Rachel's eyes as she realized what was happening. Rexy hadn't been alone after all. His family had been searching for him, just as he had been longing to return to them. With one last look at the humans who had saved him, Rexy let out a soft, almost grateful chuff before bounding toward his kind. The family watched in awe as the three raptors disappeared into the wilderness, their silhouettes vanishing into the twilight. Rachel wiped her eyes, unable to hold back the mix of emotions she felt. Jason placed a hand on her shoulder. "We did the right thing," he said softly. As they stood there, staring at the now empty clearing, they knew they had experienced something truly miraculous. They had not only saved a life, but they had formed a bond with a creature that had lived millions of years before them. And for the rest of their lives, whenever the wind howled through the valley at night, they liked to believe it was Rexy, calling out to them, never forgetting the humans who had shown him kindness.